If you have always felt different from most people, not better, not worse, but somehow off to the side of ordinary life, I want you to consider something. It may not be because something is wrong with you. It may be because your mind refuses something that most minds accept without question. And that refusal, which has probably caused you considerable discomfort throughout your life, is actually one of the rarest psychological traits I observed across decades of studying the human mind. Most people believe they know themselves. They walk through life with a clear story about who they are, what they want, why they do what they do. They feel reasonably settled in that story. They defend it when challenged. And when the story becomes uncomfortable, they quietly revise it. Not the life, just the story, and move on. But here is what I discovered in my consulting room, over and over again, across hundreds of patients and thousands of hours of careful observation. Most people do not know themselves at all. What they know is the version of themselves they have constructed to make living bearable. And the rare personalities, the people who genuinely feel different from the crowd, are almost always the ones who cannot fully believe their own construction. That is what makes them rare. Not intelligence, not talent, not even sensitivity exactly. What makes them rare is that the ordinary psychological machinery that keeps most people comfortable does not work as smoothly in them. Today I want to show you exactly what that machinery is, why it breaks down in certain minds, and what the signs look like from the inside. Because if you have been living with this kind of mind, you already recognize most of what I am about to describe. You just may not have had the language for it. Let me begin with what most people believe about self-knowledge, because that belief is the first thing that needs to be examined carefully. Most people assume that self-understanding is simply a matter of attention. Pay enough attention to yourself, and you will know yourself. This seems reasonable. It is, in fact, almost entirely wrong. The mind does not present itself to consciousness honestly. It edits, it omits, it rearranges, it protects. It constructs the most tolerable version of events and offers that version to awareness as though it were reality. I spent my career mapping these protective operations, which I called defense mechanisms: denial, rationalization, projection, displacement. They are not signs of weakness or stupidity. They are nearly universal features of the human mind. The mind uses them the way the body uses its immune system, automatically, efficiently, and almost always without the person's awareness. Here is the important part. Most people's defense mechanisms work extremely well. They do not feel defended. They feel like they are simply seeing things clearly. The story they carry about themselves feels like truth, not construction. But some minds, the rare ones, have a weaker grip on this machinery. The defenses still operate, but something keeps noticing them. Something keeps pulling the curtain back. Something keeps asking, is this story actually true, or is it simply the version that hurts least? That internal observer is what I called the observing ego. And in rare personalities it is unusually active, unusually relentless, unusually hard to silence. This is not comfortable. I want to be clear about that. Having a strong observing ego is not a gift that smooths through life. It is in many ways a source of considerable suffering. But it is also the foundation of genuine self-knowledge, which almost no one achieves, and very few people sincerely want. Now let me walk you through the 8 signs, not as a checklist, but as a sequence of psychological patterns because they are connected. Each one grows from the same root. The first sign is this: you do not simply experience your thoughts, you watch them. Most people think, feel, and react as though their mental life is simply happening to them, the way weather happens. A thought arises and they accept it. A feeling emerges and they act on it or suppress it. But they rarely step back and ask, where did that thought come from? Why do I feel exactly this way and not some other way? What does this reaction tell me about what is happening underneath? That stepping back, That capacity to observe one's own mental activity as though from a small distance is called metacognition. And in the general population, it is far rarer than people assume. Most people have almost no natural metacognitive practice. They live inside their thoughts rather than watching them. But you likely recognize this experience. Sitting with a feeling, and instead of simply feeling it, finding yourself analyzing it, wondering why it is there, questioning whether your interpretation of a situation is accurate, replaying a conversation not because you are anxious, but because something in it does not quite add up, and you want to understand what. A person with rare psychological depth does not just feel hurt. They ask, what exactly am I reacting to here, and is this reaction proportionate to what actually happened, or is something older being triggered? This is not overthinking, though it can sometimes become that. At its core, it is an unusual refusal to accept mental experience at face value. And here is what this costs you. When you apply this same observing capacity to other people, and you do almost inevitably, you begin to notice things they cannot see in themselves. You notice the gap between what someone says and what their tone betrays. You notice the decision someone frames as rational that is clearly driven by fear. You notice the cheerfulness that has something hollow beneath it. Other people find this perception uncomfortable to be around, even when you say nothing. People sense when they are being seen, and they protect themselves. This brings me to the second sign. You have an unusually low tolerance for self-deception, especially your own. Think about how the defense mechanisms I described actually operate in most people. A man is passed over for a promotion. Within a few days, he has quietly decided that the promotion was not really what he wanted anyway. The job has problems he had not noticed before. His current position offers freedoms he had overlooked. The story shifts smoothly, and he moves on. From the outside, this might look like resilience, and in some ways it is. The mind protected him from a painful confrontation with disappointment. But rare personalities do not get to do this as easily. Something inside them keeps noting the discrepancy, keeps noticing that the revised story arrived rather conveniently after the painful event, keeps pulling on the thread. Is this what I genuinely feel? Or is this what I need to believe to get through the day? This internal cross-examination is relentless in some people. They cannot accept the comfortable revision. They cannot stop testing the narrative. A woman decides she has outgrown her old ambitions. Most people would let that stand. But the rare personality keeps asking, is that true? Did I genuinely outgrow them? Or did I simply stop believing they were possible? What is the difference between genuine evolution and quiet retreat? These are not the same question, and most people never ask them, because asking them is deeply destabilizing. It means you cannot always trust your own interpretations of your own life. Living with that kind of perpetual uncertainty about your own motives is exhausting. But it is also the beginning of genuine honesty, a kind of honesty that most people, frankly, would choose not to have. The third sign is closely related. You have an unusual sensitivity to social hypocrisy. Let me describe something and tell me if it sounds familiar. You are in a room where everyone seems to agree. The social consensus is established. People nod. The conversation moves on. And you notice something. Not a different opinion exactly, but a sense that what is being said does not match what is actually happening. The agreement is too smooth. The confidence is too easy. The performance is slightly ahead of the reality. Most people miss this entirely. They read the surface and accept it. Rare personalities read both the surface and what lies beneath it simultaneously. And the discrepancy is hard to ignore. This produces a specific kind of social difficulty. You are not disagreeable by nature. You are not trying to cause trouble. But you cannot fully participate in agreements that feel hollow, or enthusiasms that seem performed, or certainties that seem borrowed rather than earned. Other people, who are not watching beneath the surface, interpret this as standoffishness, distance, arrogance sometimes. You get labeled difficult or cynical. What is actually happening is something different. You are detecting the gap between what people express and what the situation actually contains. This detection is not always pleasant for anyone involved. Here is the deeper mechanism. Human social life depends to a remarkable degree on shared performances. We agree to treat certain fictions as facts because doing so makes cooperation possible. Most people participate in these performances naturally and without great distress because they half believe them. But a mind that is constantly comparing surface to substance cannot half believe. It keeps seeing the performance as a performance, and that makes ordinary social belonging considerably harder. Now I want to introduce the fourth sign, which I think is one of the most important. You have questioned your own identity at a level and for a length of time that most people around you never appeared to. Most people settle their sense of self relatively early. They find a story. I am this kind of person. I value these things. I belong to this group. I believe these ideas. And they commit to it. The identity hardens. When it is challenged, it is defended. They are not exploring who they are anymore. They already know. This is not stupidity. It is psychological efficiency. Maintaining a stable, largely unquestioned identity frees enormous cognitive energy for other purposes. But rare personalities do not stabilize in the same way. The identity keeps coming loose at the edges. They keep encountering something, a relationship, a failure, a piece of writing, a quiet moment, that makes the settled story feel less settled, less true. And instead of defending the story, they investigate it. I had a patient, a professional man in his 40s, who had built an entire life around a particular self-image, competent, contained, self-sufficient. Every decision, every relationship, every choice of career and neighborhood was organized around this image. Then a series of events over a few years began slowly dismantling it. And instead of the expected defensive response, rationalizing, blame, reinvention, he simply kept asking questions, painful ones. Questions most people in his position never ask. Why had he chosen self-sufficiency so rigidly? What had made closeness feel dangerous so early? What had the entire construction been protecting against? These are not questions that arrive easily. They require a kind of psychological courage that is genuinely uncommon. And they require what I described earlier, a mind that cannot stop noticing itself. The fifth sign is this. Your emotional memory is unusually vivid and detailed, and it does not simply store events, it replays them. You remember not just what happened, but what was felt. The texture of certain moments, the precise quality of a particular disappointment, or a specific exchange that seemed to pass unnoticed by the other person, but stayed with you for years. This is not nostalgia, it is something more precise. It is as though certain experiences never fully finished processing. They remain active in memory because something in them was not fully understood at the time. Here is the psychological mechanism. Most people process experiences and file them. The emotional charge fades, the memory recedes into the background, and life moves forward. But highly self-reflective personalities keep returning to certain memories, not out of sentimentality, but because their observing mind is still working on them, still looking for the meaning, still trying to understand what the experience revealed about themselves or about the other person. This creates something that is simultaneously an asset and a burden. The asset is that these minds extract more meaning from lived experience than ordinary processing allows. They understand more, they see more. The burden is that the past never becomes entirely past. It remains available, sometimes insistently, as material for ongoing analysis. And occasionally this crosses into rumination, the loop where analysis does not resolve but simply repeats, producing anxiety without insight. The difference between productive reflection and unproductive rumination is one of the great psychological challenges for people with this kind of mind. The sixth sign follows naturally. You resist automatic conformity to group beliefs in a way that often feels more instinctive than reasoned. Let me describe the pressure. You are in a group, professional, social, familial, ideological. The group holds certain beliefs. These beliefs are reinforced constantly through repetition, through approval, through the social comfort of agreement. Most people adopt the group's beliefs not after careful examination, but because the pressure is continuous and the rewards for conformity are real. Rare personalities experience this pressure too, but something in them keeps resisting the automatic adoption. They keep noticing the distinction between what they have actually examined and what they are simply absorbing by proximity. This is not the same as contrarianism, automatically disagreeing. That is just conformity wearing a different costume. It is something quieter and more inconvenient. The inability to fully believe something simply because everyone around you believes it. The psychological mechanism here connects to everything I have been describing. A mind that constantly observes itself is also a mind that notices the process by which beliefs form. It catches the social pressure in the act. It notices the desire to agree, the comfort that agreement provides, the slight unease of dissent. And it cannot simply override that observation and agree anyway. This costs people. It costs them professional advancement sometimes, social belonging very often, the easy warmth of the group, the comfort of shared certainty. But it also produces something rare, genuine independent thought. Not the performance of independence, which is common enough, but actual conclusions arrived at through actual examination. The seventh sign brings us into territory that I find both the most psychologically significant and the most misunderstood. A persistent awareness of existential reality that most people successfully push to the margins of consciousness. Mortality, meaninglessness, the fundamental uncertainty of identity, the question of what any of it is actually for. Most people manage these questions by avoiding them, not by resolving them, by keeping them just out of focus. The daily structure of life, work, routine, social obligation, entertainment, functions as an almost perfect system for maintaining this avoidance. The questions exist, but they never quite arrive clearly enough to demand a real confrontation. Rare personalities cannot maintain this comfortable distance. The existential questions keep becoming clear. They intrude. They surface during ordinary moments, a Sunday afternoon, a drive alone, a moment between tasks, and demand to be looked at. This is not pathological. It is not depression, though it can look like it and can sometimes become it. It is a specific kind of consciousness that simply cannot sustain the ordinary psychological distance from fundamental reality. And here is something I observed carefully. This awareness is closely connected to everything else I have described. The same mind that cannot fully believe its own comforting narratives, that cannot accept social performances at face value, that keeps observing itself from the inside. This mind also cannot maintain the illusion of permanence, the illusion of certainty, the illusion that ordinary life is sufficient explanation of itself. Everything connects. The rare personality is not defined by any one trait, but by the systematic failure, or refusal, of the ordinary psychological machinery that keeps most people comfortable. The eighth sign, and in some ways the deepest, you have felt, at points in your life, genuinely alone in a way that had nothing to do with the number of people around you. This is the loneliness of awareness, and it is different from ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness is the absence of company. It is resolved by presence, by other people, by conversation, by belonging. The loneliness I am describing is not resolved by company. It can occur in the middle of a crowded room, during a dinner party, at a family gathering. It is the specific loneliness of seeing something that no one around you appears to be seeing, of experiencing a depth that the surrounding conversation simply does not touch, of watching the performance of ordinary social life from a position that is somehow simultaneously inside it and outside it. This loneliness is one of the costs that rare personalities carry, and it is a real cost. I am not going to tell you it is actually beautiful, or that it is the price of depth, as though that makes it easier. The isolation that comes from seeing more than the surrounding conversation contains is a genuine form of suffering. But here is what I want you to understand about its origin. The ordinary person does not feel this loneliness, not because their inner life is shallow, but because they are more fully submerged in the shared social performance. They are inside the consensus. They believe enough of it to feel genuinely included in it. The rare personality is never quite fully inside, and the part that remains outside, the observing, questioning, noticing part, is necessarily alone, because its experience is not shared by the people around it. Now I want to address something that needs to be addressed directly, because I have watched it operate throughout this conversation, and it operates in you too. There is a pull, while listening to a description like this one, toward a specific kind of satisfaction, the satisfaction of recognition, the sense that yes, this is me, this describes something real. And underneath that recognition, something that feels almost like relief. Finally, an explanation for the difference I have always sensed. I understand this pull, and most of what I have described is, I believe, genuinely true. But I want to add something important that the pull toward validation tends to obscure. These traits are not straightforwardly advantages. I have said this before, but I want to say it more clearly. The same metacognitive capacity that produces genuine insight also produces rumination. The same low tolerance for self-deception that generates honesty also generates perpetual self-doubt. The same hypocrisy detection that gives you clear social perception also makes ordinary social participation exhausting and often alienating. The same resistance to conformity that allows independent thought also costs you the warmth and ease of belonging. Rare personalities are not people who have achieved more than others. They are people who cannot rest in the places where most people rest. They pay a real price for their perception, and the payment is ongoing. I saw this clearly in my consulting room. The people with the greatest capacity for self-examination were not the most serene. They were frequently among the most troubled. Not because their examination was wrong, but because seeing clearly into yourself and into the nature of human life is simply not a comfortable experience. Self-knowledge is rarely comfortable. I want to be precise about that. The philosophical tradition promises that knowing yourself leads to freedom, and there is truth in that. But the intermediate terrain, the space between the comfortable illusions and the freedom on the far side, is difficult and often painful. Most people never enter it, and that is not weakness. It is a choice the organism makes, often quite wisely, in the direction of survival and social functioning. The rare personalities are people who cannot stay out of that terrain. Something drives them into it repeatedly, often without their choosing. Let me show you what this actually looks like in practice, because I want to be concrete. Think of a person who spent a decade in a career they felt was not quite right. Not wrong exactly, but slightly off, chosen for reasons that now seem less clear than they did. Most people drift through this feeling and keep going. They adjust the story. They find new reasons. They locate satisfactions they had not noticed before. The machinery of self-protection runs smoothly. But the rare personality cannot stop noticing the original discrepancy, cannot stop asking, why did I choose this? What was I actually seeking? What did I believe about myself that led me here? Is the discomfort a signal, or just an old habit of restlessness? These questions are not comfortable. They do not resolve quickly, and they are asked not once as a dramatic turning point, but continuously, in the background, as a low-level, permanent examination of one's own life. Or consider someone in a close relationship who keeps noticing a dynamic the other person seems not to notice. not conflict, something subtler, a pattern in how they are treated in certain moments, a faint recurring feeling that they are not quite being seen. Most people in this situation make adjustments, accept limits, build something workable. The story gets revised to accommodate reality. The rare personality keeps pulling on that thread, keeps noticing, keeps wondering whether the discomfort is significant, and the noticing itself produces a kind of loneliness inside the relationship, the loneliness of being aware of something the other person is not aware of, or does not want to be. These are not dramatic scenarios. They are the texture of ordinary life for people with this kind of mind, and they accumulate into a very specific life experience, the sense of always being slightly more exhausted by self-examination than the people around you seem to be, always looking a little harder, always finding it a little less easy to settle. There is a metaphor I find useful here. Most people glance at the mirror. They check their appearance, confirm what they already know, and move on. The mirror serves a practical purpose, to align presentation with expectation, and then they put it down. Rare personalities cannot put the mirror down, not because they are vain, but because they keep seeing something in it that does not quite resolve, something that needs to be looked at longer, something that shifts when examined from a different angle. This is the observing ego at work. It is not easily silenced, and it produces a life that is, on balance, more examined and more authentic than most lives, but also more difficult in the specific ways that examination and authenticity are always difficult. Now let me come to what I think is the deepest level of this. The psychological defenses that protect most people are not arbitrary. They are constructed in response to real experiences, often early ones. They protect against real pain, the pain of inadequacy, rejection, failure, mortality, the frightening size of unconscious desire. When I say that rare personalities have weaker defenses, or that their defense mechanisms are less automatic, I do not mean they feel less pain. I mean that they are more likely to know that they are in pain, and more likely to keep examining what the pain is actually about, rather than rerouting it into something more manageable. This matters deeply, because most of what people experience as settled certainty about themselves, their values, their preferences, their identity, is partly construction, partly a management of something that would be harder to face directly. Rare personalities keep encountering the managed quality of their own experience. They keep noticing that the certainty is partly constructed. They keep feeling the gap between the story and whatever the story is protecting against. And in that gap is where most of the important psychological work of a life takes place. I have heard people describe this feeling in many different ways. A sense of inauthenticity in their own life, without being able to name what would be more authentic. A persistent feeling of not quite having arrived at who they actually are. A recurring sense that the versions of themselves they present to different contexts are each partly true and partly performance, and somewhere beneath all of them is something more real that they cannot quite reach. This is not pathology. This is the experience of a mind that takes its own depths seriously.